Water is with us in our most cherished moments. By taking care of the small things, we honor the big. And by shaping the large, we don't overlook the little. Our crucial infrastructure ensures a city and its people can do more than survive. They can flourish. A balancing act of nature's unpredictability, met with respect, foresight, and ingenuity. We serve a diverse and expanding city, while inspiring that city to keep on growing. Because it's the moments we share with water that matter most.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Grant Hodges, a board member at Infrastructure New Zealand. Technology has an ever-increasing role to play in our lives and in our industry. Technology can help us manage demand for our infrastructure. It can help us deliver better asset management, as well as help us design and deliver new infrastructure. We've got a really exciting session this afternoon, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Steve Webster, who's going to lead us through that session. So Steve is the Chief Infrastructure Officer at Watercare. He's a civil engineer with more than 25 years experience in senior leadership roles in the infrastructure sectors in New Zealand and Australia, delivering projects and maintenance services to government, local authority and private asset owners. He's Watercare's CIO. He's responsible for Watercare's delivery of infrastructure projects, from servicing strategies through planning to construction, and for supporting external developer services to enable growth in Auckland. Steve is the executive sponsor of Climate Change for Watercare, of both the 40-20-20 vision and enterprise model for the delivery of Watercare's infrastructure program. Steve is a member of the construction sector Accord Steering Group and the Construction Strategy Group. So over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Grant. Tēnā koutou katoa. Once again, Watercare is a proud sponsor of Building Nations. Just a few things around Watercare. Watercare provides water and wastewater services for Auckland, as you've seen in the video. We service a community of 1.7 million people. We have two core streams of business that allow us to provide this service: the here and now and operations and customer support, and secondly, delivering for the future, which is detailed in our asset management plan, which forecasts the investment required to support a growing Auckland. Many of our investments are reasonably traditional and assume we need to treat water, transport it, take waste away and treat that as well. The laws of physics and nature dictate a large portion of how we do this. But as an organisation that plans 50 to 100 years ahead, we must continually look for new and emerging technology that can support us in delivering our core services. In customer and operations, we look to technology that will support us to do our basic functions faster, more accurately, with less cost, and importantly, to improve our customer service. We implement bots to do repetitive system-based tasks. We use submersible drones to inspect our dams, acoustic sensors to find leaks. We've implemented membrane technology in the treatment of wastewater to significantly improve the treated product we return to our environment. We have a state-of-the-art centralized nerve center that enables us to have a real-time visual understanding of everything that is happening in our system. We're also investing in superbugs to make our treatment of wastewater more efficient, using 70% less energy and an overall reduction in emissions. And we have just landed a mini thermal hydrolysis unit for trial, a New Zealand first that will shake up our biosolids management. When we look at our future investment, the problems we are solving are enabling growth, addressing climate change, renewing assets, ensuring we have adequate resilience and improving service levels. To improve how we deliver our infrastructure, we have 4 areas we focus on. We call them accelerated outcomes. We're constantly looking for new technologies to support us. Just quickly, these areas are supply chain integration. We've developed deep relationships with our entire supply chain. We want to unlock their collective potential. Secondly, manufacturing principles, prefabrication, modularization, reducing on-site time, improving quality, reducing risk. Thirdly, in digital, design, construct, and operations. We want to unlock new technologies to improve how we deliver, including digital twins and artificial intelligence. And fourthly, people, improving safety, well-being, importantly, continuity of work, career paths, training and development. So looking for and implementing new and emerging technologies is vital for us and enables us to deliver our infrastructure program better. But all I've described will only get us so far. In parallel, we must rethink how water is utilised in New Zealand. We must treat it as precious, use it in a circular fashion, closing the loop on a water use, reuse the byproducts of our wastewater treatment processes, recycle purified wastewater, capture and reuse stormwater, just use less water, provide real-time usage information to our customers, giving them the power. To develop these solutions, we must unleash the power of our communities and, importantly, listen to and act upon the Te Ara Māori worldview. Solutions are emerging. We're implementing some now and jointly planning for others. Now, we do not have all the answers, but as a nation, we must embrace our communities and look for and develop new and emerging technologies. Which brings us to our next speaker. I have immense pleasure in introducing Dr. Catherine Ball, a scientific futurist, an advisor and speaker who works across global projects where emerging technologies meet humanitarian education and environmental needs. Catherine is an associate professor at the Australian National University, an honorary associate professor at the School of Cybernetics. Catherine is leading conversations around technology and its place in the current and future challenges in Australia and the Asia-Pacific region. Catherine is also a proponent of community engagement with STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and is a demystifier of emerging tech. Before we pass over to Catherine, just some quick housekeeping. There will be a 10-minute Q&A session following Dr. Ball's keynote presentation. Please place your comments and questions in the discussion forum. And I also strongly encourage you to post updates on the event stream. Now, please welcome Dr. Catherine Ball.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. And I'm not sure if it's good morning or good afternoon. It's still good morning here. I would like to acknowledge that I am dialing in from Gubbi Gubbi Land, just north of Brisbane Airport here in Moreton Bay in Queensland. Really sorry that we can't be physically together. We were looking forward to it, but circumstances have been beyond our control. And I think that if we start to learn with the fact that circumstances are going to be beyond our control a lot, it's kind of the new normal, which is a terrible expression, but it is effectively what we're facing. I'm really excited to introduce to you, hopefully, some new buzzwords, some high-level concepts, some real case studies. And I really encourage you to ask me the most awkward and interesting questions you can possibly come up with, because everyone loves a good awkward question, and I'm certainly one of those people. So we may have heard 10, 15, 20 years ago, the new buzzword was sustainability. Everyone was talking about sustainability. There were chief sustainability officers. Everyone was all about sustainability. Well, welcome to the new buzzword for the rest of the decade, which is cybernetics. I'm going to be introducing you to this concept and working through some examples around it. But if you've never heard of cybernetics before, you have now. This is where you heard of it. So one of the things we know we're going to have to live with is we are walking into a post-pandemic economy. Now, I would like to say in terms of infrastructure, what we're looking at here is a post-pandemic opportunity. One of the things that we know we have seen over the past maybe 100 different economic cycles is that when there's a slowdown, the first place large government turns to is infrastructure as a means to boon the economy, the unemployment figures, and to stimulate and kickstart the economy. So there's nothing new there, is there? Well, what we're also facing here now is a convergent economy. So this is where technology is actually becoming the convergent technology, which means we've all got smart devices, right? I assume you all have like a smartphone, but all of us used to have digital cameras. Do you remember like in the early 2000s, we all had digital cameras and we all had regular analog watches. And as all of our technologies have started combining into singular devices, that's called convergence. And so with regard to the post-pandemic economy, the reason why I've chosen this particular picture from Brisbane and not one from Auckland, I could have chosen Auckland, I suppose, but I know more about this one. So I used to live literally on the other side of that bridge. Behind a bit, there's a house called Yungabar House. And if you ever manage to get to Brisbane in the next couple of years, I'd recommend that you head to Kangaroo Point. Not only has it got a famous pub, but this bridge is also the only bridge in the world where you can abseil off it and do a climb. And the sunset climbs are gorgeous from this bridge. But that's not really what I thought that maybe when they were planning this bridge that it would be used for. Like, well, you know, when you're building an asset, do you think, oh, you know, in 100 years' time after we build this, they're going to be running tourism events walking along the top of this bridge? That wasn't, I think, in the planning minds of Mr. Story himself, who was the public servant that actually approved the Story Bridge. Some interesting facts about the Story Bridge. It's one of the largest, and I have a bit of a thing for steel cantilever bridges, it has to be said. They are beautiful. It's one of the largest in the world. There are 1.25 million bolts on the Story Bridge. And you're like, this is great, Kath, but you're talking about emerging technologies here. So what are you going on about? So 1.25 bolts on this Story Bridge need to be checked on a regular basis, even if it's just a level 1 bridge inspection. When you're not touching it, you're just looking at it. And traditionally that is done by hanging people off ropes and putting people on ladders and basically putting people in harm's way. And though we try to mitigate the health and safety impact of any kind of workflow, there is a way to actually remove people from that particular loop. So everybody now in the world can use a drone to do a level 1 bridge inspection. Drone technology, since I've been involved with it in the past 10 years, you could call it dog years. Drone years and dog years are very similar. It's about 70 years of development in 10 years for certain in terms of some of the technologies, but definitely in terms of some of the business models. And the thing that's the kicker is the health and safety legislation. So health and safety legislation here in Australia tends to focus on this idea of if there's another way of doing it and you don't do it, then that could be corporate manslaughter charges all the way up to the C-suite, past the C-suite and to the board level. So what are our board directors doing about recognizing the strategic influence of new and emerging technologies? Now, this is not to behave like someone like Uber, for example, who just started operating without any regulation. That's not where we're at with the drone industry. That was the drone industry 10 years ago. It's not the drone industry now. So there are people who do this really easily for a living. We have electrical infrastructure. I mean, you know, Australia is pretty big. Queensland, I think, is it like the 17th largest country in the world or something like that. And we have long power lines. And there was a chap that was going out doing a power line inspection, and he was walking through very high grass. And he unfortunately got bitten by a tiger snake, and he unfortunately passed away. Now, after that death, there was a whole review around what people were doing walking to power lines, you know, in high grass. And they figured that a drone could do what he was going to do, which was literally look at the top to see if there were any birds nesting in it. And so it took a death for them to change their methodology. My biggest desire is when we look in the face of new and emerging technologies is that they become so well understood and demystified to actually be seen as just completely a normal opportunity to use. We know that when technology is invisible, that means it's finally become something that's every day. Like, we don't even really think about the fact that you've got more robotics and AI power in your smartphone than they had on the moon lander in the 60s. You know, you can't exactly use that to land on the moon, but it's got more computing power and more smarts in it. And there's more ways in which we trip ourselves up on it than we probably even really know. And so when we're looking at this post-pandemic economic opportunity, and infrastructure is a core beating heart of how that is going to grow over the next few years. How do we now start saying, we don't just want to use drones for a bit of bridge inspection. We actually want to incorporate the best of all we know about convergence and emergence in terms of new technologies and opportunities, not only in the planning and construction of how this entity is going to operate, how this infrastructure is going to operate, but how it's going to be managed, how it's going to grow, what its place is going to be for some of these other new and emerging technologies. So here, you know, around the world, we've had our telecoms people rush to grab things like, you know, places to put mobile phone towers. And there was a Telecommunications Act put in here in Australia so they could force people to have telecommunications infrastructure, even if they didn't want it. So how are we building our infrastructure to be the backbone of the new and emerging technologies that don't even exist yet? And this is where we have to start becoming a little bit prescient. But I'd say if you're working in infrastructure, right now, you're probably in a very good place. And when we look at something like the Story Bridge or the construction of a large asset that we're all looking at, we're all renewing assets, we're all updating assets, we're all constructing assets, road, rail, everything is going to change in the next 10 or 15 years in terms of how we're going to use it. So we actually have to make sure that things are multi-purpose and adaptable and adoptable after they've been constructed. And that's very difficult when our planning and our design and our restrictions of engineering and our restrictions of finance constrain how it is we build something. Out with the constraints. We have to start thinking about how we operate, create infrastructure in a very different way. Hence lovely technology. I'll put that down and I'll just click through the screen with my finger. Old school. Okay, so it's an interesting thing to see now. And Jacinda Ardern has also mentioned this idea of trialing a 4-day work week. Well, the original study around the optimal work week was actually done in Japan in about 2012, 2013. And they figured out that a 3-day work week was actually the most optimal work week. Now, I am a huge fan of the fact that the one thing the pandemic has brought is the death of the open plan office. I think the open plan office, a bit like Amsterdam Airport, were both designed by the devil, and they really aren't conducive to any form of people have a voice for theatre like me, working alongside people who may be more introverted. I used to have to scurry away and hide myself and even leave the office to have phone conversations and Zoom conversations because I was just annoying everyone. I didn't even mean to. But people sometimes like to work quietly. Well, they can work from home quietly now. Maybe the way we work in our offices and use our office space is going to be a different way as to why we are actually coming into the city. Now, as a working mother with 2 children under 4, one of the things that I have really appreciated, and I've seen my friends, particularly in Victoria, really struggle with this, the idea that there's a separation from home and work. And when you work from home like I do quite a lot, or work remotely like I do quite a lot, I need still inside my house a separation from home and work. So this death of the city that we're seeing is not going to be permanent. So I was up in Cape York a couple of weeks ago. So I traveled through Cairns, and as I was walking through Cairns, and you've probably seen this echo in places like Queenstown, large tourist-centric developments and cities and towns. In Cairns, there were more shops closed up than there were shops operating. Like there were more for lease signs and for sale signs than there were shops that were actually functioning. And I was like, this is like my hometown of Nuneaton during the global financial crisis. This is what happened during the GFC. People literally shut up shop almost overnight. It happened so fast. And I think here in the Antipodes, we really avoided the worst of the GFC. Our economies actually did really well compared to many others during the GFC. So we're now seeing it because of the pandemic. And I mentioned this to my husband, who's an Australian. I was like, you've not lived through Thatcher. You've not lived through the GFC. You've not seen some of the economic downturns that can come from different kinds of political, geopolitical, financial, public health, anything. But you know what? We ride the storm, we come out the other side. So if we look at the new workforce that's wanting to maybe do a 6-day fortnight, maybe they'll do a full 6 days and then they just won't go in for another 4. Or maybe they'll literally 1 week on, 1 week off. We're not going to see a reduced rental in our infrastructure that reflects that because we're no longer allowed we shouldn't really have open plan offices. Airflow, ventilation, making sure that people work in spaces where we know who've been working in that space so that if someone gets sick, you don't have to close down the entire floor. You just close down a particular area. So looking at people that work, with indoor kind of architecture, looking around this idea of public health. And one of the things we know is that our cities are still a part of who we are and how we identify. But the tree change and the sea change that the pandemic has brought has meant we need to see our cities in a different light. How can we rebuild our attitudes towards cities? And I know that Lucy Turnbull was doing some great work on this around the Sydney Commission. She was posing the question of how do we build our cities to fight obesity? How do we build our cities to save water? Sustainable urban drainage systems were a huge thing 10, 15 years ago. So it's good to see that these things are finally business as usual. How do we build our cities to fight climate change? How do we build our cities so that drones and autonomous vehicles can operate? How do we build our buildings in our cities such that they have an opportunity to evolve alongside how they're needed going forwards? So it's almost like we have to throw everything that we know out of the window and start again. We need to start again. And from this, I feel like we're walking through a one-way glass door. If we don't make something out of this opportunity in terms of how we think differently about how cityscapes, urbanscapes, and outback or rural, regional, remote spaces are going to work, and we all talk about the smart city, the smart suburb. Big conversations now are about the smart outback, right? So how do we take what we know and the best of everything we know and apply it to some of the most difficult problems that we're facing? I always, whenever I go to the US, when the borders all open, I'm not allowed to travel back into Queensland yet. So I'm feeling all the same as in New Zealand. I'm allowed out, but I can't get back. And so I used to travel to the US a lot, and I would always diet ferociously for like 2 weeks before I'd go to the US. Because if I went to the US, I'd easily put on like 5 or 6 kilos because I couldn't walk anywhere in half of their cities. They weren't walking friendly. And if you were walking around, people sort of thought there was something wrong with you. The culture there is very much in the car ATMs. First ever donut drive through I ever went to. I was just like, what is this? So do we want to live in our cars, or do we want to live on our feet? Do we want to be walking around our cities, looking at how we use our cityscapes? New York has done some great work on this with using their railway lines as like art and wilderness zones. And I remember a few years ago, maybe 12 years ago in London, the big buzz was green roofs. Everyone was talking about green roofs. It was part of that sustainable urban drainage system, the idea of slowing that stormwater flow so as not to override the system and cause flooding downstream. And biodiversity was a huge thing. Well, now, unfortunately, drone landing pads are going to start competing with the solar farms and the green roofs and everything that we want to use our roof space for. So let's have a look at the walls and not just concentrate on the roofs. Let's have a look and see how we can actually build in using solar paint, for example. So your entire building can be a solar farm. You don't need photovoltaic panels. How do we build in smarts and AI around when air conditioning is switched on, switched off? How do we encourage people to exercise just naturally, just by, shutting off an escalator and let them use the stairs or something like that? I'm obviously talking there from people who are able to do that. And so then we have to look at how do we actually build in accessibility for people who don't have the full accessibility like we do? How do we make our cities a more egalitarian space? Just a little anecdote. When I was in Melbourne with my first child as a newborn in the pram, I first realized then how inaccessible parts of Melbourne were to people in wheelchairs. And I always thought I was quite aware of that. But the little windy windy, I hope they come back, or those beautiful coffee shop, little alleyway type places in Melbourne that were just part of that culture of that city have just died a death. But the stairs and the systems, having to pick up your child, and carry them down, just even from a train station, trying to get out onto the street there at Flinders Street Station. No one had ever thought of it. I just tried my clicker again, but it didn't work again. Okay, so we take all of this. We look at all the multimodal data that we're bringing in. We look at all of the different ways in which our cityscapes are going to be 4-dimensional. We've got to start thinking them now as cybernetic systems. All right, so our cities and our infrastructure, each building is a cybernetic system inside a larger cybernetic system, inside a larger cybernetic system. And how we actually cope with the way the technology evolves, the data that we're capturing, how people are interacting, all of that information. There was a statistic that I mentioned again the other day that 90% of all the data that's ever been created in the world happened in the last 2 years, and this is speeding up. It's never been this fast. It's never going to be this slow again. As soon as you have anything like blockchain technology, ledger technology, data systems that are backing up data systems, we have legal requirements to keep copies of documents for 7 years. What does that mean in terms of the carbon footprint of the data storage? And unless we sort out data storage in terms of its carbon footprint, that's actually apparently estimated to be, in 10 years' time, 25% of our global footprint in terms of our carbon and climate change emissions will be purely from data storage centres. So there's a massive opportunity now for green data storage. And we know people like NextDC here in Australia are really cracking on with making sure that they're carbon neutral. And I'm sure other ones are too. That's the only one that I've actually heard of. But people don't realise that when you delete an email, that's it. That's great. It's gone. When you archive an email, it is kept in perpetuity on a server system somewhere in the Arctic Circle or wherever it is they're building all of their systems now, up a mountain in New Zealand, trying to keep it cool, to keep the electricity costs down. And this is a worry for me, because people, when you screw up a piece of paper and you put it in the recycling, or you put something in the recycling or in the rubbish bin, you see it, you tangibly feel it. It's a visceral thing. It goes in the bin. With digital, you don't see it. You don't realize how many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of emails that you've still got sitting on a server, just sitting there, keeping that carbon footprint being produced. And if you think about, people are going to electric vehicles and trying to eat differently, but how can we actually manage any of this? And so I've got this slide up as a bit of a poke in the ribs here around artificial stupidity, because we don't call it artificial stupidity, do we? We call it artificial intelligence, like it's some kind of panacea, like it is going to solve the problem for us. Humans love to delegate responsibility. It's not our fault, it's the government's. It's not our fault, it's the laws. It's not our fault, it's this computer that won't work. It's not our fault, it's the people that are selling me that service have a responsibility. Polluter pays principle, right? Like, push the packaging back, it's their fault. When I buy a plastic bottle with drink in it, and then that goes and sits and doesn't get recycled, ends up in a waterway and ends up in the bay of a whale belly. That's not my fault. That's because they produce the plastic. That's not the case. We cannot be beholden to this idea that we are no longer in control of the waste we produce. And the digital waste we produce isn't just about all the random cables and the plastic bits and bobs. It's actually about the emails that you're storing, the photos that you're storing, the videos that you're storing. And so how do we handle the data that we're collecting? How do we archive it? How do we interrogate it? How do we back it up? How do we prove it's safe? What systems are co-located, commingled? How do we look at a cybersecurity framework that sits around all of this? Any kind of ledger system, backup system, double copies of anything, you are doubling the carbon footprint. You are doubling the carbon footprint. You are doubling the environmental impact that you're having from moving into a digital system. So artificial intelligence and machine learning are going to be two incredibly powerful tools that we're going to be using. And the infrastructure world is absolutely part and parcel of this. When we look at the data that your buildings will be able to capture as smart buildings, and the data that your buildings will need and your infrastructure will need as smart systems, these systems will all talk to each other from a central point. And when you have everything at a central point, you are looking at the potential for drowning in data and starving for information. We all hate it when computer says no. We all like it when computer says yes. And so how do we make sure that we don't fall over? Big warning around all of this is what happened to Sony. When they were hacked, everyone had to down tools. They had to literally let go of every single electronic device they had. They rushed to the stationery cupboard, and the cupboard was bare. Find anywhere to write down notes or anything. It crippled their entire industry, their entire business. Are you ready for a major cyber attack? Are you assuming that how you operate is safe? So we talk about forks in the road, and forks in the road are a really interesting concept for me because I think a lot of us have experienced forks in the road that have actually then just become loops. They've actually just looped back around on themselves. Now, we know that autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles or pilotless vehicles, driverless vehicles, uncrewed vehicles, something without a human being in charge the way a human being currently is, are coming. We all have levels of autonomy in the vehicles that we drive, in the planes that we sit on and fly. And the ways in which those traffic areas are managed are more computerized, data-centric, and backed up by automation than we've ever seen or probably even understand before. And now I have family on North Shore, so I know what that traffic is like coming into Auckland sometimes and how that's changed a lot in the last few years. And I wouldn't necessarily say for the better. But what do we do if I said to you now that my children, age 2 and 4, are the last generation to have driver's licenses? We will be using the current infrastructure right now for automation of these systems in, say, the next 30 or 40 years. So when you look at a road like this, and this is Shanghai, nice, lovely, multi-level road, and it can all make our eyes go across, but you can see the logic as to where things are going off, the junctions. Those of us that drive cars can kind of see the logic behind these things. The infrastructure that we have now will, in the next 5 years, have to incorporate somewhere driverless and automated vehicles, be them hovering, be them flying, be them driving, just like a Tesla or a Nissan Leaf or whatever you've got that's your automated electric vehicle. How on earth do you integrate driverless with drivers? And the answer is you don't. When it comes to operating drones, we've got this real issue called SimOps or ConOps, and you never want to have a near miss with another aircraft. You always want to be in your own 4-dimensional space. So the way we're going to be flying drones, even in our cityscapes, is they will have their own corridor. The way we're going to be operating driverless vehicles, they will need their own lane. On the motorways and the highways that we have, there will be an automated vehicle-only lane. That is my prediction. It's already coming. Entire cities in China that have been built in the last 10 years all have automated vehicles only in the inside of their city centers. Helsinki, when they wanted to integrate the driverless vehicles, they just basically stopped everyone going in. London, do you remember when they brought the congestion charge in and everyone threw the baby out with the bathwater and hated this idea of the congestion charge? Well, now they love the congestion charge. Well, guess what? Soon you won't be able to physically drive a car into London. My bet in the next 10 years, it will be autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles only, apart from maybe emergency services vehicles. So this is where I want to leave you. I want to leave you with this concept today at the end of this presentation around this concept of new cybernetics. So cybernetics is, in a nutshell, where humans, technology, and the environment form a beautiful triangle and they work together in beautiful balance. Now, we're talking about the future and new and emerging technology here. So why have I got a picture of a fish trap in front of you? Now, this is a fish trap or an eel trap, which is one of the earliest forms of aquaculture known to humankind. The lakes around this area, called Budge Bim in South Australia, have been carbon dated to over 6,000 years old. The fish traps we know have been used up to about 100 years ago. Indigenous engineering, First Nations engineering is contemporary engineering. If I needed to switch these bad bad boys back on right now, they could start working again. This is not about looking at steam power. This is looking about how you use the resources around you to solve the problem that you're facing. So new cybernetics isn't about, I've got this somebody who wants to sell me this drone solution, or I've got this thingamajig that's going to save all of my artificial intelligence. I've got a large way in which we can change how water goes down this particular waterway. That's not what it is. What's your problem? What's your problem? I think it was Albert Einstein said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 90% of that time thinking about the problem and 10% thinking about the solutions. And this is how we need to think about new and emerging technologies. You identify your problem and the solutions will come. You build it, they will. The idea that cybernetics, technology can be your toothbrush, it can be your hairbrush, it can be the computer that I'm working through, it can be a newfangled bionics enabled, automated card payment system. It could be anything. We won't even need cards to swipe on and off of public transport. You'll just be using my face. And so I'd like you to really try and get to that inner Yoda and meditate on this a little, in that the projects that you're working on and the problems that you're facing, meditate on your problem. Don't meditate on the solution. And this is why. These are my babushkas, and I love this example. We talk as futurists about the 3 Ps, which are what's possible, what's probable, and what's preferable. So that's a really nice way sometimes when you're looking at a project, you just go, right, stop, hammer time. Let's just take a pause and think everything that's possibly possible about how we could work this. Then obviously you have legal frameworks and economic hands that then steer you towards actually what's probable about your project. But then you have your social license, your environmental impact, and you start to work out what's preferable about your project. Now, that's your babushkas, that's your Russian dolls. And you'll start out with a really huge, great concept, and you'll end up getting smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to that last one, which is the one that has been shaped by all of the influences, all of the bias, all of the economics, all of the technological limitations to get you to that. The problem is, not a lot of us think like futurists, and it's a really hard thing to do because it's so unnatural to human beings. You have to forget this concept of the permanent present. Whenever we create something, we go out there and go, right, oh, look, what technology is out there? No, you're already too late. You need to be thinking 5 or 10 years of how is this technology going to converge, emerge, diverge? How is it going to evolve? And how is it going to influence not only the construction of this asset, but the life cycle of this asset? We're not necessarily just building things for 5, 10, 20 years. We're building things for 100 years, and then we're working out how to recycle them. Everything has to be circular. Everything. We need to make sure everything is circular. So there you go. If you're ever stuck on a project meeting and you don't know how to talk about your problem, remember my babushkas, remember my permanent present, and remember my possible, probable, and preferable. And just stop and just think. If we were to redo this now and think of all the science fiction movies that we see, what are the technologies that we're going to get to? Deep immersive VR, headsets. Zuckerberg wants you in a headset. Do you want to sit in a headset? It's a very good question. This is actually already a bit passé, this photo. The fact they're even wearing headsets and not just wearing like regular glasses. The fact they're wearing headsets, they're not just got contacts in. I think it was a Google contact lens that was powered by the salt in your tears. Very poetic. But we're going to be looking at things in a hyper-real way. So when you go to plan your hyper-real, multimodal, 4-dimensional models of your cityscapes, of the buildings that you're building, any project that you're working on, remember the babushkas, remember the permanent present, and question every single model that you see. Ask about where the data set is coming from for that model. Ask to see the errors and the bias inside those models that fit inside. And as architects, designers, and infrastructure creators, we have to also think about how do we build blank space? How do we build an opportunity to change once we know that the way it's going to work is going to be different? So emerging technology is exactly that. It's emerging. And a very quick example is QR codes. QR codes 5 years ago had basically died a death. They were a boring technology that no one really knew why they were there. And some food provenance people still used them. And, some parcel people still use them. But really, what were QR codes used for? I think every one of us knows what a QR code is used for today. So the final kind of thoughts for me, this we're nearly ready to the questions. So I hope you've got lots of interesting, juicy questions for me. Is I want you to think about fourth industrial revolution was all about the Internet of Things. The fifth industrial revolution is all about the Internet of Bodies. So how are human beings going to be interacting with your infrastructure? How is your infrastructure going to be interacting with humans? Like I said, there's supermarkets, entire supermarkets where you don't even see a human. You walk in, you take what you want, you walk out, and it bills you because it knows who you are and it knows what you've picked up. and it just bills you. And it's, how great is that to prevent shoplifting? Like, you can't enter the store unless it can see who you are, so you can pay for the goods that you pick off the shelves. And artificial intelligence is going to get that way with our public health. Now, Napoleon, the French dictator, once said that an army marches on its stomach. Well, we know that our economies march on our public health. So when it comes to sensors around public health measures, the Internet of Bodies is already here. This is not new. It might be new for the infrastructure world, but you will be asked or relied or be used for camera technology or sensor technology to help monitor public health if you've not been already. And that makes sense. Everything from a smart toilet that tells you if you're dehydrated or got diabetes, all the way testing to look for COVID-19, all the way through to weighing people when they go into the station to see how many people are obese or not, to microgate analysis, where you can actually pick up things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's before someone's even got a diagnosis. The question here is, who owns that data? And unfortunately, we don't own our own personal data, which means then could our health companies, our health insurance companies, buy that data? So my health insurer might know that I'm sick before I do. What does that mean? I don't have an answer for you. But the final thoughts for me is that we started this conversation about this post-pandemic economy. And I'd like to end this conversation on our climate change economy, because we know that climate change is real. We've known about it. The climate change physics, was invented the year I was born, 42 years ago in 1979. That's when they first came up with climate change physics, and that rules and understanding sets never changed. We know what's happening. It's undeniable what's happening. And so it's also undeniable that wherever there lies a problem, there lies an opportunity for us to do something about it. And though we might be smaller nations in the world, in Australia and New Zealand, and also my British accent might betray me slightly a little too, we are ones that are ingenious. We are ones that come up with some of the best solutions. We lead the change. And I'd suggest the climate change economy is no different from this. And so you have to ask yourself, do you want to be the first person on the wave, or do you want to be the fast follower? And I think that both the drones and robotics industry have seen New Zealand and Australia as great sandpits to play in, with conducive regulatory environments, with conducive small businesses and government investment and use cases that are absolutely spot on. And the things that have been developed in recent years in both New Zealand and Australia have now taken out onto a global stage. And so I think that ag tech, massive opportunity for infrastructure and the climate change economy, and for the New Zealand economy, movies, media, all of that esports, all of that work. We know we've got some champions there in New Zealand that are game changers around some of the software around sports. And yeah, just owning that conversation, owning that place around the table, and recognizing that infrastructure is the beating heart of how this economy is going to, your economy and the Australian economy and the British economy. Infrastructure is going to be something, and Biden's just signed off on their $1 trillion infrastructure plan, right? This is going to be how we trigger conversations around economic growth. But how do we make sure that the conversation around climate change is not lost when we're having those conversations? Now, I believe I have gone slightly over time by like 2 minutes, but I'm hoping that my final parts of ranting may have given people lots of things to put in the question channel or things to talk about. Steve.
Right. Thank you very much, Catherine. Look, a broad and very entertaining and just a fantastic presentation. It's certainly a lot of challenges ahead of us. Yeah. There are a number of questions, but we do only have 6 minutes, 33 seconds actually left. So I'll jump into some of those. So
if I can't get to them all, people can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to continue this conversation afterwards.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for the offer. So one question is what are some of the quick wins for New Zealand in the emerging technology space that you could see?
Drones and robotics and automation. Okay, so you've got a wonderful test site that's just being developed just south of Christchurch, and hopefully as soon as the borders open up, I'll be coming over. So in terms of some of the investment that the New Zealand government through Callaghan Innovation has been putting into some of these tech developments, they are already in a stage of maturity and business as usual that are ripe for the picking in terms of success.
Right, thank you. New Zealand's a small country. We're a big city really. And so how do we grab this as a country, as opposed to just individual organisations going off and doing their own thing for the benefit of New Zealand Inc?
I think New Zealand is actually a lot more powerful than you give yourself credit for in that statement there, Steve, because we know that New Zealand is responsible for a massive swathe of ocean, the way that Australia is. And we are both countries that are girt by sea to a certain extent. And there are relationships between places like New Zealand and the Cook Islands, where you have protectorate access to water and you have to protect water. So one of the things we know with regard to geopolitics and new technologies, that if you control the Pacific, you control the world. So I think we actually have, as both New Zealanders and Australians, an opportunity to protect Antarctica using the technology that we know. And I think the Antarctic research that comes out of both New Zealand and Australia is the best in the world. And owning that ocean space as well as the land space in terms of that psyche of what is New Zealand Inc., I think would be huge. We've got another billion human beings coming on the planet in the next 10 to 15 years. We are turning to the oceans for so many things. Planet Ocean is being asked to help us solve the climate crisis. It will be asked to help us feed the next billion people. It will be asked to help us transport and communicate across the Pacific. It will, we will be called upon as the Antipodes, as gateways to Antarctica. And so how do we protect Antarctica? And how do we protect whales? And how do we protect some of those ocean assets that we know need to be protected and not destroyed in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years?
Yes, thank you. Another one is we're also looking ahead at the unintended consequences of the use of tech. It sounds like we need to make giant leaps, but can ethics, legislation, and communities keep up with this?
Oh, I've just been writing a book on this very subject. It's a brilliant question. We know that technology always leads regulation, but we also know that new and emerging technologies require social license. So this is not actually something that has any kind of standard precedent behind it. So the question should always be, how do we have healthy public debate around new and emerging technologies? Now, one of the things could be said is that the COVID vaccines that are based on the mRNA technology have been dragged through the media in terms of, interrogation in ways that lots of other technologies and drugs and vaccines and public health and various things from the last 100 years never have had that scrutiny upon them. Misinformation and fake news has killed people, basically. And so this whole idea of in science we trust, except yes, I believe that we need more digital literacy and we need more STEM literacy so that we can actually identify what is fake news, and we can actually even understand in general what an RNA particle is and which kind of RNA we're talking about, and basic cellular biology. Can you imagine if we all knew basic cellular biology in an intimate way? The conversations around synthetic biology and mRNA vaccines would have been for the last 2 years an incredibly different set of conversations. So for me, it's all about digital literacy, and STEM literacy is a human right to answer this very question.
Yes, okay. So another one here, New Zealand often struggles to secure new technology, and I appreciate that we are adopters of technology and we're actually pretty good at it. But if we, due to some of the, and some of the reasons is due to some of the high costs and accessibility. An example here is left-hand drive vehicles, or EVs, for instance. Do you have any insights that you can share with the Australian experience?
One of the things that I always recommend is that if you fund the ecosystem or build the ecosystem, then it allows you to attract people in. There's been a lot of money spent and a lot of work done by the Australian federal government, and I know the New Zealand government has been doing this too, to actually attract in the people who are leaders in their fields by basically showing them the lifestyle of New Zealand and Australia, and how they can grow their businesses and how they don't need to be sat in, Silicon Valley. They can actually live in beautiful New Zealand or beautiful Australia and grow their businesses on a global platform in exactly the same way. So we need to have local growth, absolutely. We need to train local people and have ownership of it from New Zealanders and from Australians. But we also need to recognize the power of some of these some of these leaders in their fields. Can you imagine if Elon Musk moved all SpaceX operations to Australia? That would mean what that would mean for the Australian government, for example, for the Australian economy. And I think that you've actually got some really great homegrown talent. I have to actually say that New Zealand is very good at creating technology. And one of your giants of this is Peter Jackson. And look at what he's just done with Weta. So I'm
Yep.
sorry, I don't actually subscribe to this idea that New Zealanders aren't very good at inventing things. And you've got Sir Ian, and I'm forgetting his last name now, that does the sports software, and he's down in South Island there. So you've got a Knight of the Realm that's there. You've got a couple of Knights of the Realm there in New Zealand that are homegrown talent. So the thing is, how do we retain that talent? How do we not lose them to Silicon Valley? How do we keep national ownership of the assets that they create so that we can have a national pipeline for our own next Peter Jackson? And next Elon Musk will be, homegrown and stay where they are.
Right, so we have only 16 seconds. We've got time for one more question. I'm going to go.
Are we going to have to go? I don't know. Are they going to cut us off?
I'm not actually sure. Grant, what happens here?
Go,
One
have a
quick
quick
one.
one. Go on then.
Well, it's actually not that quick, but maybe if you can give us a quick answer. What role do you think cybernetics, including tools such as digital twins, can play to help demystify complex city growth problems, and particularly in engaging the community?
Oh, I think digital twins are absolutely the answer. Everything from having people put on headsets or stand inside holographic situations where they can see how a new building or new piece of infrastructure is going to affect their life. I know that people were using drones on construction sites so that you could see the view from the 15th floor of what that apartment might look like in a way to try and help sell it. But one thing I love about digital twins is that it allows you to play with things. And this is where the metaverse is coming in. And this is where we can engage kids, and engage communities around what would we do if we changed it here a bit? How would we do if we changed it here a bit? If we needed to add something here, if we needed more space here, and you can actually do that so quickly in real time. I remember my husband worked for an architect and how you'd have to build the little models of how the things were going to be. Well, those models are so quickly changeable now, and the data in and the data out of those models is so dynamic in a way we've never had before. Very exciting times. BIM was just the start of it. Full immersive holographic experiences of multi-level, multimodal infrastructure is the way forward. I look forward to seeing some coming out of New Zealand soon.
You're right. It's exciting and it is engaging, isn't it? For
it
everyone
is.
that gets involved.
Yeah. I love it.
Right.
Get it in the art gallery. Get everyone walking through it. Love it.
Yes. Thank you. Grant?
Thanks so much.
Great. Hey, always a sign of a very good session that you really can't squeeze it into the time. And I think there was absolute demand for more questions. So thank you for keeping going. Hey, huge thank you to Catherine and Steve for that super interesting session. Sir Ian Taylor was the name you're looking for there, Catherine. Hey, look, Bridges, Death by Snakebite, Margaret Thatcher. They were certainly not topics I'd have expected to be covered in Future Tech, but very pleased to hear them. Cybernetics, convergence and emergence. Thank you, Catherine, for some new language for me to try on my software engineering student son when he's next home. Finally, a quick thank you to Watercare, a session sponsor, for finding such an interesting and inspiring keynote speaker. And I'd also like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon and for some great questions from the audience, and apologies we couldn't get through them all. Look, I do hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, the rest of this afternoon, and have a great relaxing weekend when you get to it. Thank you.